in this session, we are covering resources and information and communication that forms part of the series on ED-ISQM1. Back to the House of Quality Management, you will see that resources and information and communication in the green and grey blocks are the basis of quality management and provide support for the other components of quality. Why was there a need to make changes? What is new? In extant ISQC1, only human resources were addressed under the banner of resources. But there's been an increase in technology, in the use of technology in performing engagements and also in facilitating operation of systems of quality control. For example, firms using technology to monitor investments in entities where they are not allowed to have interests, independence, declarations, and so forth. Also, the IAASB noted that intellectual resources are really becoming essential to enabling performance of quality engagements. Intellectual resources would be something like an audit methodology of a firm. Now, the changes that was brought in based on this were that new principle-based requirements were included now for technological resources and intellectual resources. Just on a side note, financial resources are addressed in governance and leadership. Thus, it was not included in here. Now, to compare the changes from extant ISQC1 to ED-ISQM1, apart from paragraph numbers changing, you'll see that the title was firstly human resources, whereas it is now resources because it includes technological and intellectual resources. There was also a requirement relating to performance evaluations and incentives that was in an application material paragraph that is now included as a requirement. Just looking into a little bit more detail, extant ISQC1 under human resources talked about establishing policies and procedures to ensure that competent and capable staff that are committed to all the right principles were appointed, that engagements are performed in terms of the applicable standards, and reports issued are appropriate. Those policies also needed to identify the engagement partners and their roles, and this should have been communicated to those charged with governance. Lastly, the policies and procedures also deals with assigning appropriate personnel with necessary competence and capabilities to engagement teams. There was also a section on assigning responsibility for the engagements to engagement partners and dealing with the competence and capabilities of partners and staff, and the responsibilities of engagement partners should be clearly defined. All of this is in extant ISQC1. Now in ED-ISQM1, as we said, intellectual resources and technological resources are included, and it is now based on the risk assessment process that the entire new proposed standard is based on, listing 7 prescribed quality objectives, requiring the firm to identify quality risks and assess them, and then lastly, including a prescribed response. Although in resources, you would note that there's not a list of required responses, but that firms are required to design and implement responses themselves to address all of the identified quality objectives and risks. Looking into a little bit more detail, what are the actual quality objectives in the new ED-ISQM1? Firstly, under human resources, there are enhanced requirements for obtaining the right people with competence and capabilities to fulfill their functions, and then assigning them to engagements. Then there are new requirements where I previously said in extant ISQC1 it was only in the application material. Now it's a requirement addressing evaluation of personnel and personnel's compensation, promotion, incentives, which are linked to quality. Under technological resources, new requirements have been included for obtaining, developing and implementing and also maintaining technological resources using terminology in the IT realm which is aligned to the proposed ISA 315 revised. Then under intellectual resources, the objectives are brought in also for obtaining or developing, implementing and maintaining intellectual resources. This includes, like I said, methodologies of the firm, guidance and other support tools. Looking at the responses, we've already said that firms are required to develop and implement their own responses. None were specified. It's up to the firm's discretion to determine this. But what can be done is firms should look at the application material for the quality objectives under resources, as this would already provide some guidance. All right, moving on to information and communication. Why was there a need for a whole new section like this? Extant ISQC1 does not specifically address the broader need for information and communication and did not really acknowledge the two-way nature of communication. It wasn't dribs and drabs all over different sections or elements of quality control, and it wasn't specifically dealt with separately. Now, information and communication is brought in as a new component to quality, and it talks about information systems or platforms, two-way communication, the responsibility of all personnel for this, and having robust communication during engagements. Additionally, communication with external parties were very specifically brought in, talking about all forms of communication. Now looking at where was communication referred to in extant ISQC1, you'll see relevant ethical requirements, human resources and monitoring included various paragraphs, but it was really just touching on communication matters that should be communicated. While in ED-ISQM1, apart from similar paragraphs included under some of those headings, there are very specific quality objectives and responses. Now looking just a little bit more detail in terms of these changes, ED-ISQM1 prescribes 5 quality objectives. The firm is once again required to identify and assess quality risks in terms of these objectives. And then there are 3 prescribed procedures or responses that should be brought in, apart from additional responses that the firm may need to bring in to respond to their quality risks and objectives identified. Now looking at the actual quality objectives under information and communication, there's a very specific new requirement to have an information system, or in other words, an information platform that supports the system of quality management. An information system may be less sophisticated in the case of smaller to medium practices, but some sort of system or information and communication platform should be held. For example, think of a small firm that might have a specific place on the server, folder allotted, and all of the information and important communication should go through that, and maybe a specific email address. Larger firms would have much more sophisticated systems and databases and use of technological resources to achieve this. Another new requirement, which I've alluded to previously, is to ensure robust two-way communication within the firm. Not only from the top down to the bottom, where the firm needs to communicate relevant and reliable information to personnel so that they can understand what they need to do to carry out their responsibilities, but also upwards. That means personnel must communicate relevant and reliable information back to the firm. That is where the two-way come in, as the arrows there indicate. And then specifically, which really links up to this requirement, is the new requirement for all personnel to take responsibility for the exchange of information and communication. So everybody must take up a responsibility in terms of this. There's also new requirements addressing external communication on the firm system of quality management. I will deal with it a little bit more in the responses side, because that is where the detail is included, where we touch on transparency reports. So let's look at these required responses. First required response is establishing communication policies or procedures. So you can see it's more formalized and structured, so that all the right communication does happen and the right information is shared as required. It's required to communicate responsibility for implementing the firm's responses to all personnel, because everybody has a role to play. It is not only a governance and leadership responsibility, but all the way down to the personnel forming part of engagement teams. Then the new requirements addressing external communication follows a principle-based approach and addresses various types of communication with external parties. We talk about networks, service providers, and other external parties, and all of this is seen as external communication. Then the requirements very specifically talk about considering instances where transparency reports could be brought in, but for scalability purposes, because a smaller firm might not necessarily have the need for such a formal way of communication, but might have alternative means of communicating information regarding their system of quality management to external stakeholders, firms are just encouraged to do this. So it does allow for smaller firms to follow an alternative approach. So looking back at this, in summary, resources goes wider now and has evolved with the times and has brought in the modernization of the standard with technological resources and gives due recognition to the intellectual resources. Together, and then information and communication. Yes, the external communication was brought in, but there's a big focus on everybody's responsibility and the two-way communication that needs to happen. This wraps up information and communication and resources. Thank you.